The grand plan of Russian foreign policy on the eve of the First World War barely existed. Essentially, Russia under Tsar Nicholas II preferred a system of making it up as it went along. Whatever they needed at the time, they would then turn and push for. What this shows us is the sheer power Russia felt they had on the globe. They did not feel they needed to play these long games and set up these master plans. Instead, they believed they held enough weight to be able to throw it around as they pleased. Instead, the Tsar and Stolypin, his Minister of Internal Affairs, were more focused on Russia internally, modernising the nation. Russia saw many economic, political and military reforms during this period. This meant that, in Europe, their policy was one of maintaining the peace. That's why they joined the League of the Three Emperors, why they would later have 2 more attempts at an alliance with Germany, all defensive agreements. However, after repeated failures there, followed by an offer to receive the largest national loans in history from France to fund their modernisation, they flipped sides, and thus the Entente was born. Despite them joining these military alliances, peace was the objective, at least for the time being, as only peace could truly fund what Russia needed most: the chance to industrialise and catch up to the rest of Europe. Germany's worst fears had come to pass: a Franco-Russian Alliance of 1891. The treaty goes as follows. If France is attacked by Germany, or by Italy supported by Germany, Russia shall employ all her available forces to attack Germany. If Russia is attacked by Germany, or by Austria-Hungary supported by Germany, France shall employ all her available forces to attack Germany. The two must mobilise the instant one of those listed foreign powers mobilises, and the rest is the usual. Neither power can sign a separate peace, Russia betrayed that one, the sharing of information in times of war, and all clauses must be kept secret, etc. 2 interesting little details, however. 1. It is specified in the agreement that the goal, if Germany was to be involved, would be to crush Germany from both sides, a war on 2 fronts. And 2. One of the final lines of the agreement states, the present convention shall have the same duration as the Triple Alliance, implying that this was indeed an anti-German treaty, in everything but name. Fun fact, as France and Russia both shared a colonial rivalry with Britain, the British government first thought this was an anti-British alliance. It was not until the French clarified that they will not support Russia in a Russo-British war that it was publicly anti-German. Although another reason behind the creation of this treaty was due to fears that Britain may have joined the Triple Alliance. However, their lack of a major long-term plan does not mean they did not get involved in the grand theatre of the time. The British nation was heavily reliant on its trade routes, especially those linking it to India. If these were to snap, Britain would crumble. This was Britain's weak spot. It's why they held on to places like the Suez Canal, Malta, Gibraltar, and all of them, to secure a good, strong trade network. It's why Napoleon, Kaiser Wilhelm, and Hitler were so obsessed with isolating the nation, basically besieging the entire island into attrition. This weakness terrified the British, and the world knew it, but it was Russia who posed most risk here, and so Russophobia developed in Britain. Russia, after the Russo-Turkish War, almost was able to claim Constantinople and the Dardanelles Strait. This would have given Russian warships direct entry into the Mediterranean. This is why Britain intervened and controlled Russia's gains. In addition, Britain feared Russia would invade through Afghanistan into India. This led to what is known as the Great Game, where eventually treaties between the two powers had to be signed to safely agree on where the borders of those frontier nations would lie, and the creation of buffer zones. Were British fears justified? Perhaps they were. During the Crimean War, Russia did indeed plan an invasion, and further plans were developed for a massive assault on India. The British government, in a war report in 1901, believed that their troops in India would not have been able to hold out against such an advance. However, modern historians have analysed this, and believe the Russian plan would never have been able to work. Britain would have easily held out in this scenario due to terrain and supply issues on the Russian part. But that does not matter, because Russia, it now appears, was not playing standard chess, but 3D chess. Russia knew it was likely not possible. However, they still wanted to pose the threat of it being an inevitability. If Britain was forever fearful of Russia, then in future Russia could use that threat they posed to their advantage in Europe. Britain would have to be more favourable to Russia elsewhere to ensure good terms, was at least the plan. This led to the alliance between the two powers. Britain saw a chance to remove Russia as a threat with this alliance, so were happy to enter into talks. But how would the alliance between the two, known as the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, have been useful to Russia? Like how France heavily invested into Russia, the Germans had the same relationship with the Ottoman Empire. One such investment planned was a railroad stretching from Berlin to Baghdad. A German-Ottoman Austro-Hungarian union would potentially pose the risk of destabilising Russia in the event of a war. And as we know by history, it did. You could also argue a stronger Ottoman Empire, backed by the Germans, may be able to throw off the British and their influence, invade Egypt and own the Suez Canal, maybe even attack India itself. For these reasons, Russia and Britain came together, in retaliation to the growing German-Ottoman relations. However, it is also interesting that this suddenly friendly Russia to Britain comes 2 years after their own humiliating failure in the Russo-Japanese War, where the main bulk of their navy got wiped out. The treaty was a normal defensive alliance, followed by the settling of some border disputes. Influence over southern Persia was granted to Britain and the north to Russia, with a neutral zone in between. So it's clear we are only talking about influence, not occupation. Persia, although it did not have the strength to do anything about it, did not recognise the partition. In addition, both must stay out of Tibet, militarily and politically, and Afghanistan was recognised as being under the British sphere of influence, a point of no entry for the Russians. Lastly, Britain invested heavily into Russia. As for their interest in the Mediterranean, this likely was also part of the Great Game, but it's important to consider the theory of Russia's constant search for a warm water port. In winter, Russia's northern ports often freeze over, and then the ships can get stuck like sitting ducks in the ice. Russia has a long history, even to this day, of trying to gain access to these warmer watered ports as bases to store their navy in winter. Therefore, you could argue this is why they wanted these straits. You can even argue this is why modern Russia still wishes to hold on to Kaliningrad and why they got involved in the Crimea. It's important to note, however, not all historians believe this to actually be part of Russia's foreign policy. The final front of interest to Russia was the East. They thought they could have some easy conquests in the region, which would inspire the Russian people again in favour of the Tsar. Russia would lease Port Arthur from the Ming dynasty, and began connecting it to the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was not yet complete. Port Arthur was a warm water port, but in the Far East. China went through the Boxer Rebellion, and Russia, to defend the railway plans and Port Arthur, sent more troops into Manchuria. Japan was not happy about these extra Russian troops pouring into the region, a region that they wanted for themselves. Japan declared war on Russia and seized Port Arthur with speed. The Russian navy from the Baltic was now needed in East Asia. Not long after, about to sail out of the Baltic, they saw the fleet of ships before them. Japanese, they thought, and so the Russians began firing. These ships were actually British, and after the situation was settled and the brief war scare was avoided, Russia was forbidden from using the Suez Canal in this venture, and instead had to take the long way round. Japanese in the Baltic? Come on Russia, seriously? Russia lost on land in the Battle of Mukden, and when their fleet eventually arrived, it was also defeated by a smaller Japanese fleet. Russia lost and was humiliated, further destabilising the empire. Russian interest primarily existed in the Balkans. Here, Russia wished to expand their influence, create Russian loyal vassals, or at least nations reliant upon them. This is where Russia's main direct foreign policy took place. They wanted to be seen as the defender of all Orthodox Slavs, which eventually pulled them close with Serbia and Montenegro. Their Balkan goal would grant them more warm water ports in the Mediterranean, better trade, the chance to surround Austria-Hungary in any future war, and would have minimal impact on the stability of Russia internally, as it would not have been outright conquest. In fact, moves had already been made in secret. A protocol was established between Russia and the Balkan League, stating that if any power wished to initiate a war, they would first have to reach out to Russia in advance, and if Serbia and Bulgaria disagreed on a matter, it would be resolved by Russia, and Russia's word would be binding. But then everything changed. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia's ally. Russia did not immediately declare war back, but began a partial mobilisation, ready for such a possible event. The German Empire warns Russia to stop mobilising, and inevitably mobilises itself. Austria-Hungary begins its attack on Serbia, and mobilisation in Russia goes under full swing. It seems clear at this point. Russia has made up its mind and is going to war, but no announcement came. Germany warned Russia again, but Russia did not stop. Germany then, as discussed why in the last video, declared war on Russia. 5 days later, the Austro-Hungarian Empire does the same. I find it interesting how Russia never declared any war. A lot show it as being Big Russia defending Serbia against Austria-Hungary and then Germany stepping in. But in reality, Russia was getting ready to step in, of course, but it was Germany who cut them off and declared war before Russia could do anything. But now it's thought experiment time. The war was going badly, and in 1915 the Tsar went to the front to lead his men. What if the Tsar turned out to be a military genius, and the troops fought with a tremendous spirit, never seen before on the battlefield? They have success on all fronts, and begin to rapidly advance into the territory of the Central Powers, winning stunning victory after stunning victory. Russia in 1918, now a stable victorious power, holds the most important seat at the table. This is not going to be alternate history, merely a thought experiment to portray what Russia wanted from the war. This is an interesting case, as former Interior Minister Peter Denovo states in 1914, before the war, even if Russia was victorious over Germany, what would they gain? Poznan? East Prussia? But why do we need these areas, densely populated by the Poles, when we are not so easy to cope with the Russian Poles? He goes on to state that Russia had great trade relations with Germany, and such a war was not worth the risk of ending these. However, we can get at least some info from the 1915 Constantinople Agreement, signed between the Triple Entente. In the event of victory, Russia would gain Constantinople and the Straits from the Ottoman Empire. So let's start here. Russia likely would have gained this territory in this outcome, finally granting them a strong naval standing in the Mediterranean. In addition, land in the Caucasus would have gained their sovereignty from the Ottomans, becoming Russian vassals, or at the very least under the sphere of Russian influence, to create a buffer zone in the Middle East. With further Ottoman territories falling to Britain and France, I think it is likely that the Ottoman Empire would have collapsed. What would have become of this region, I have no clue. Instead of Turkey, we may have got goose or duck. Either way, it does not matter. This is not alternate history, just a thought experiment to better understand Russia. Austria-Hungary could have been divided as it was historically, but you have to think about the political game that was plaguing Russia. If Russia becomes the last main European autocratic monarchy, then that weakens the Tsar's position in his own country. Politically, they'll be alone. In our timeline, Europe was split into many republics. With Russia victorious, I think it is likely they would instead have rather maintained the balance of power and regimes to better support their own legitimacy. It really depends on what Russia decides internally. If the Tsar takes the risk and continues his own autocratic position, then I think the German Empire and Austria-Hungary, they would prefer to do the same. But if Russia became a constitutional monarchy, then I believe again they would have forced the conquered down that same route. Although Tsar Alexander III did talk of dismantling Germany into smaller states again, if victorious, but that was a very different Tsar and position to the one in power in 1914. But I cannot see many major territorial changes happening in this timeline. Instead, Russia's territorial gains would be minor against the two powers, with the largest extension possibly being Galicia. Polish nationalism was kept in check by the fact that their territory was split between three different great powers. Russia would not want to create another Serbia in Poland. The Orthodox Slavs would have likely been liberated, however, but not as one larger united kingdom. Instead of Yugoslavia, we would likely have seen a Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. This keeps the Balkan states weaker and therefore more reliant on Russia. In the real world, a real alternate history, Poland may have become independent, but ruled over by the Tsar. But again, this thought experiment is, if Russia did so well, they would have full control over the treaty. Again, it's just about finding out their plans and what they wanted, and understanding it from their point of view. War reparations would almost certainly be expected from these central powers to help fund industrialisation, and maybe help cover their debts to France and Britain. If anything, the main gains of Russia would likely have been in the Balkans, as Russia becomes the main protector of the Orthodox Slavs in the region. A Russian absolute victory is difficult to predict for the sole factor of their own instability. They had their own problems to deal with back home, and more land would just mean more internal struggles. Anyway, hope you enjoyed and learnt something. Leave a like if you did. Subscribe to get notified of next week's video. Share with anyone you think may be interested. This has been the history of diplomacy.